There's one occasion, actually, when he was trying to remember a name and he called his manservant and asked him, who was that person? And, what was his name again? And the manservant replied, well, I don't know, sire. I've only been in your service for 500 years. It was, on the one hand, he was clearly talented. He clearly had abilities. He was a real presence and had much to say. But in their minds, was he a fraud? Was he a charlatan?
Oh.
The Ascended Master Saint Guling, who spoke through Dr. King, has stated that he lived for hundreds of years. He himself said he was over 500 years. He was known to go into long periods of meditation. I mean by that over 40 hours at a time. I understand from Dr. King, even within the spiritual hierarchy, he was a radical. He had more radical ideas. He could have ascended, but delayed his ascension in order to engage in worldly affairs and serve humanity. And you could see why. He was very engaged in the world. I think where there is a big change now is that what matters is service. An advanced soul who's approaching ascension, they look at number one, how can I serve? And number two...
Hello and welcome back to the Spiritual Freedom Show. My name is Darren Ball, and this is the podcast helping you to awaken your chakras, to unlock your psychic powers, and to discover true spirituality. In today's show, we step into the candlelit salons of 18th century Paris, where whispers stir of a man who never ages and talks about ancient events as though he were there. Revered by some and doubted by others, he was described by Voltaire as the man who knows everything and never dies. But who was he really? So in this episode, we pull back the veil of mystery surrounding one of history's most enigmatic characters, the Count St Germain, and explore the profound truth that his story reveals, which is the path to your own immortality. Richard,
Darren,
let me set the scene here for the show today. Here's a little bit of a short story. So it's Paris in 1740, and the salons glow with candlelight. There's whispers that stir behind feathered masks. Perhaps 100 years earlier, the same man had been seen before, but he has not aged at all. Elegant and with great wealth and an ageless appearance, Count St Germain was, according to Voltaire, the man who knows everything and never dies. He spoke of distant lands with the ease of one who had just returned, of events that unfolded centuries ago with the eye of someone who was present at the scene. Was he? He appears to eat nothing, to drink sparingly, holds forth on all manner of subjects with outstanding knowledge and exceeding brilliance. He is seen at the courts of Europe and at The Hague, advising, whispering at resolutions, brokering a peace. Some say he is hundreds of years old, others that he cannot die. Did he really have the elixir of life? And who was he, really? An immortal? An alchemist? A master? Or something more? So today we explore the enigma of Count St Germain to reveal the truth about our own immortality.
Superb.
So I'd like to start here, Richard, a little bit of background maybe about who Count Germain really was. Maybe one or two stories that you have that might reveal a little bit more about this enigmatic character.
He's a wonderful, wonderful man, a master, an ascended master. He was actually a great friend of Dr. King. On more than one occasion, I've been to Santa Barbara to visit Dr. King, a couple of occasions with Alison, who was a great student of material about Count Germain, a lot of which is written in French. So Alison's very conversant with a lot of it because she can read French. So she has an advantage because some of it hasn't been translated. But you can find a lot about him. And like all great people, really great people, he's been attacked as well. There are allegations. Some call him a fraud. Some have called him different things. Others revere him immensely. One of his great disciples was someone whom I've had a contact with myself psychically by the name of Count Cagliostro, who is not ascended, who's also been greatly derided and clearly did make some mistakes, but at the same time was very much a devotee of Count St Germain. There's so much one could say about him, but on more than one occasion, Alison and I have been to have an evening drink with Dr. King in Santa Barbara in his small motorhome on the patio in front of his house. And Dr. King has said, "Oh, Germain's just left." So
not many people can say that.
No, and he didn't say Saint Germain; he would say Germain. They were close, and there was actually Count St Germain blessed more than one of the shapes. That's the Kragen-Lecken shape that the Aetherius Society does manufacture and sell through Dr. King. because that's so close to a Great White Brotherhood or Ascended Master retreat up there in Scotland. But I mean, I have a lot of opinions about him, and I can only give them as opinions. What I find interesting is that for quite a long period, and you read an example of it, he was living a very connected life. In other words, by that I mean that he was functional. He wasn't just appearing and then disappearing.
I see.
He was living somewhere. People could visit him, and according to several reports, did visit him. He attended banquets, for example, at Louis XV's court. Apparently, he didn't eat all the food that was served at these banquets. Sometimes brought his own food, which might be some grains, unusual things. And he was a great raconteur, and he would talk about things that happened hundreds of years ago, even back to the life of Jesus, his meetings with St. Peter, and others.
Wow, so it's more than 1,000 years.
At that point, yes. And there's one occasion, actually, when he was trying to remember a name, and he called his manservant over. He had a couple, but one particular one, and asked him, who was that person? That, what was his name again? And the manservant replied, well, I don't know, sire. I've only been in your service for 500 years. It was the statement you quote by Voltaire was written to Frederick the Great, who also was interested in him. He was, people, some of them had an ambivalent view. They didn't know what to make of it. On the other hand, he was a highly skilled individual. He apparently had the color dye factories, or a factory at least. He was very much into perfecting colors. He was obviously an alchemist, and there are stories of him absolutely transforming base metal into gold. He was a violinist. He was a musician. The one story I heard is that he could, paint with two hands at the same time.
This is someone who's clearly a prodigy.
He was, but his main motivation always was humanitarian. He was known to go into long periods of meditation. I mean by that over 40 hours at a time. And then to come out of that knowing all that he needed to know.
It's also clearly very advanced.
He was definitely advanced. I myself, I think I'm right in saying that Saint Guling, the Ascended Master Saint Guling, who spoke through Dr. King, has stated that he lived for about 600 years. I could have that slightly wrong, but it's hundreds of years. He himself said he was over 500 years. I do think myself, and this is me speaking now, that Christian Rosenkreutz is a very significant figure. It wouldn't surprise me at all if that was one of the identities of Count St Germain, an earlier identity. And he was the founder of Rosicrucianism. Count St Germain is connected with Rosicrucianism. I think some of the mystics, particularly Western mystics through history, have looked to him as virtually, you might say, their guru. I would include in that people like Sir Francis Bacon, who was said to be Grand Master of the Rosicrucians in England. I would include in that Dante, certainly, as I mentioned, Cagliostro, and others, particularly on the other realms, but not only on the other realms. And of course, he was the great alchemist, and the true meaning of which is transmutation, which has taken on an even vaster, greater meaning since the Nine Freedoms was delivered.
Yes, yeah.
Because it is the absolute key.
Well, actually, the alchemy is a good segue, I think, into what we'd really like to talk about today, which is about the nature of ascension and what that is. But just before we go there, you talked a little bit about, that he was an alchemist. I mean, some people have reported that he had something like the elixir of life, some way that he prolonged his life. Yeah. What do you think about that?
I think it's extremely interesting because if he was an ascended master, he wouldn't need an elixir of life.
I see.
Because he would be ageless anyway. So either it was a front or he really did have one. And this is where I come back to my point that he was very engaged in daily affairs. For example, and you touched on this, he turned up at The Hague in Holland to negotiate for peace, I think, in a Prussian war. And he traveled. I mean, he traveled to India on a boat, according to the records. Yeah. Now, an ascended master wouldn't need to necessarily do that, I would say. They could just go there.
Yeah.
I think he could have ascended and delayed his ascension in order to engage in worldly affairs and serve humanity.
Mm-hmm.
But it does seem a marked difference between what we know of his life in the period you were describing there and how he operated later. For example, later he warned about what was going to happen in the French Revolution before it happened.
Mm-hmm.
And he had a contact with people at court. And one of the people was a lady in waiting of Marie Antoinette. And he sent her a note after his funeral. Now, there is a funeral, a reported funeral of Count St Germain in 1784. And even Madame Blavatsky, who talks very highly of him, questions that, but doesn't rule it in or out.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a possibility, that's all I can call it, that he was an ascended master of that caliber in every regard,
Yes.
but chose to delay this in order to serve more directly until the time came when he discarded his body, because when he then appeared to the lady in waiting of Marie Antoinette that I mentioned in a church after his funeral, and she received a note from him, a written note, and met him in a church, he warned very, very seriously about what was going to happen in France to her, hoping that she'd pass it on to her mistress, Marie Antoinette, the queen or the empress, I think it was queen, wasn't it, in those days of France. He then disappeared. So what you have from that period going forward are more sporadic appearances. For example, Stephenson, who invented the steam engine, he appeared, I believe, to him. He's said to have appeared to Tchaikovsky. There have been other appearances. Later on in the 20th century, there was a very interesting mystic by the name of Fulcanelli, which Fulcanelli is derived from volcanic, Vulcan.
Oh, I see.
Which is the image of the blacksmith in the forge, which is an alchemical image, which it is believed by some, including me, to have been a way that Count St Germain worked through that identity.
Another identity.
But again, he would just appear sporadically. He was very much in hiding. One person who I did get some communications from the other realms from, a gentleman by the name of Jolivet Castello. You can actually find him. I looked him. I'd never heard of him, of course. He was an alchemist. He was a chemist as well. I think he was a count, French count, I believe. And there's a mystery about who produced the Fulcanelli writings. I would attribute it, this is again an opinion, to Jolivet Castello, but under the influence or guidance of Count St Germain.
I see.
Certainly he's Fulcanelli, which again could be Count St Germain, is said to have appeared and spoken to a renowned chemist, I think a French chemist, certainly in Paris. Actually, I've been to the location where this is said to have happened. It's a cafe, but it's a very good cafe in France, still exists. And he warned him, this chemist, about the dangers of nuclear experimentation. And I think this was about 1937.
Oh.
So this is prior to Nagasaki and Hiroshima and
Manhattan Project, everything.
Yeah. He was warning about that, which is, I could fully believe that he would do that. So there does seem to me to be a big structural difference between the way he operated, Count St Germain, and he had more than one identity, and he traveled a lot. As you mentioned, he went to Germany, to England, to other countries, India, he said. When he actually met the woman I mentioned, the lady in waiting in this church in France, he said he'd just returned from China and Japan, I think.
Okay.
But he also certainly was said to have visited Egypt. And Madame Blavatsky describes him as an Oriental adept, I believe.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So his roots being there. And he did say he would need to return to the Himalayas. So extrapolating all of those things, it might be that he decided to do this, and he was given permission to do this, and he operated in the world so he could have more direct influence over affairs and actually talk to people at Louis XV's court and many others. I think he met Horace Walpole, one of the prime ministers in England.
Oh, okay, yeah.
They were all kind of what you can see sort of ambivalent about him. On the one hand, he was clearly talented. He clearly had abilities. He was a real presence and had much to say. He was a big raconteur and talker, and an impressive person, or in their minds, was he a fraud? Was he a charlatan?
Sure.
And you get this running through his whole life, really, in that period.
I think what you touched on there quite interesting in terms of answering the question of if it is true that he had delayed his ascension in that first period that we talked about, why would he have done it? It sounds like that there's an opportunity there to do more to serve humanity as a whole.
If it's true, then and it's my contention. I mean, this is just me though, so don't take it as fact. I think it makes him all the greater, and all the more in tune, and one can see why he'd have so much in common with Dr. King, because he was a radical. And I understand from Dr. King, even within the spiritual hierarchy, he was a radical. Now, a radical within the hierarchy is not like a radical on our level,
Sure,
because he would completely obey his superior officers and cooperate with the plan. But he had more radical ideas of change, and you could see why. He was very engaged in the world. Traditionally, some of the hierarchical members have stayed more in the background. Actually, I'm going to rephrase that. Not in the background. That's the wrong word. They're very engaged. We wouldn't even exist without them. That's the first thing we have to remember. Without the ascended masters, male and female, of all races, we wouldn't last for more than minutes.
Yeah.
They're holding the karmic balance on Earth. We owe each and every one of them the very greatest debt for experience itself on our world. So that's the starting point. But they've tended to be, I don't know if this is the right word, so forgive me, but more reticent, less engaged in the experiences and affairs of humanity, and more of an influence, you might say.
Yes, yeah.
There's quite actually an account of the master Kut Humi, who's one of the most prominent of them, and he did get engaged through the Theosophical Society in particular. Very much so, through Madame Blavatsky, and there are false claims of contact with him as well. But there's a description of him given by Leadbeater, who claimed to have observed him in the Himalayas, I believe in somewhere either in Tibet or close to Tibet.
Okay.
And he was seated in his garden, and a female attendant brought him something to drink, and he sat there, and then he wandered off and into the house, as it's described, played a few notes on his keyboard, his organ keyboard, came back out, thought, and Leadbeater says, very, very good, that on the face of it, looking at him, you wouldn't think that he really was doing very much. But he said, and then he went through what he was actually doing. When he was thinking, he was influencing these people here,
I
here.
see.
When he played those few notes, he was inspiring various composers here, here. And it was all, and in fact, he's said to be the inspirer of composers. Cyril Scott wrote a book about that, The Secret Influence of Music, which I described to Dr. King over a dinner once. And Dr. King said to me he thought it was a brilliant concept.
Wow, nice endorsement.
Yeah. He didn't sort of say, I know this to be true or not, but he thought it was a brilliant concept that these composers didn't come, and I'm talking about the likes of Beethoven, of Wagner, of Delius, of Tchaikovsky, of, César Franck, several others. They didn't come primarily to write and leave us music. They came to bring certain changes and influences through the energy that some of the music that was written which could have been written or improvised alone. I mean, Grieg, for example, just to name one, who actually I believe possibly to be maybe the most evolved of them all, although he's not listed as the greatest of them all by most musicians. He's sort of in the top 10, but he's certainly a candidate in my eyes as a possible avatar, because he also led a perfect life, which quite a few of them didn't. But he spent hours and hours, in Norway, wasn't it, writing, playing the piano in a kind of a hut.
I see.
I think in the fjords, actually, in that region. And people would gather around and listen sometimes. Now, the point being made in this book by Cyril Scott is that whether that music was ever written down, played and performed or not, it was going out into the ethers and bringing change. Beethoven would bring, say, humanitarianism. Chopin would bring, say, refinement. they bring different energies
I see.
to the table, and it was a concept. But all of it under the influence overall, he said, of the Master Kuthumi. An ascended master gets everything right. And Dr. King himself made this point. I mean, there's a massive difference between entering cosmic consciousness, which is the highest state of consciousness that one can enter, and there are different degrees of it, as we've discussed before, depending how entirely you raise Kundalini. And I've dipped my toe in that particular ocean, but I've got a lot of depth to still penetrate. But there's a big difference between that and ascension, massive difference. And in fact, you won't find anywhere a better definition, analysis, guideline, guidebook to follow than you'll find in the 9 freedoms.
Yeah.
Because the 6th freedom is a truly outstanding freedom. And I certainly appreciate it much more than I ever did. For one thing, to ascend, you've got to be able to consciously induce cosmic consciousness. Now, we've talked before about Arjuna, who was given cosmic consciousness by Sri Krishna, Yogananda, who was given it by his master Sri Yukteswar. I believe that I was assisted by a cosmic force when I received my experience a couple of years ago. That's one thing. Dr. King, though, could just do it. I mean, he could go off and consciously induce it, and he entered cosmic consciousness several times. And an ascended master would be able to do that. So that's one thing they'd have to be able to do. Even more important than that, they have to rest, W-R-E-S-T, all the vital lessons from the essential experiences of life. Now, that's enormous and very important. So coming back to Count St Germain, he either had done that already and he was then delaying, which would be my contention,
I see.
or even he was still dotting a few I's, excuse me saying it like that, crossing a few T's, resting the experiences. My view would be he wouldn't need to be doing that in his particular case. But for a lot of others, it can take lives to move on that trajectory. I mean, you've got to be able to enter the highest states of samadhi at will. And that's a massive thing. And at will would mean under a whole variety of conditions, not just in an ashram, a beautiful ashram, a cave in retreat in the Himalayas or wherever it might be. But, Dr. King entered samadhi in Waterloo, in public, in a TV studio for a different purpose, but he still entered it.
Yeah, I think just to underscore what you're saying, because I think it's such an important point for our viewers to hear, is, there's so many people who speak very glibly about ascension as something that's just sort of going to happen and will happen to, humanity as we move into this new age. And yet, I mean, what is revealed in the 9 freedoms and what you're, highlighting here is that there's actually, even after the point at which you get to a stage which virtually no one has achieved, at least at this moment on
a handful.
A handful
in
perhaps.
History, yeah.
Where you can enter this state of cosmic consciousness at will. Even after that, we're still talking about an enormous amount of further advancement.
And when you can enter it at will, then you can consciously induce it, and then you have to master every essential experience. Doesn't mean you've got to do everything and gain, but you've got to rest. I think the phrase in here is the vital lessons.
Yes.
And those you need to learn. And the only way you can demonstrate you've learned them is to manifest it through experience. And that's where some of the old yogis went wrong. You can't do it in your cave. You've got to come out, even if it's just for a short while. And you've got to then, it's a little bit, this is a crass example, but friends of mine, I have a friend who was an alcoholic. And this person said to me, it's one thing to not drink when you sort of bottles are removed from your sight.
Sure,
It's another thing to be able to go into a bar, sit down with people who are drinking, and have a water.
Totally.
That's a small example.
Yeah, but you can see how it will apply to every experience.
And likewise, you've got to be able to master these things in the world and all the experiences that you need in your karma to work out. There, you've got to have complete control. You've got to behave in a perfect way. You've got to, and good conduct. I must say, I appreciate that more than I ever did. It's absolutely crucial for all of us in all conditions. But of course, the greatest good conduct is service, and the greatest possible service.
One point I want to come back to here, and kind of a theme of the show. We're talking about our immortality, and I think in the story of Count St Germain, we find that in two ways. One, in this kind of previous period that you're talking about, where he appears to have lived and claims to have lived for hundreds of years. And then after that, even as an ascended master, as we know he is now, is now continues to inspire and influence people on earth in his role now as a part of the spiritual hierarchy. And again, this is someone who is now beyond death. And so what is that, if we bring that back to ourselves, I mean, what is that telling us about, what death really is, about what a promise of ascension is for us?
Absolutely. I mean, one thing I should have mentioned, by the way, and which I missed out in terms of the Count St Germain appearances, was in around Mount Shasta in California. It's very much connected there. I'm coming to your question, but
Sure.
and I think it was Guy Ballard was said to have met him, and others have claimed it, and they were said to be given the elixir of life. And you had to be very careful, though. There's a lot of false claims. But one great thing that came out of that was the I am movement. In its origins. It's got deviated, and some people have gone off with it and misused it, I believe. But the original concept of I am came through that. I think that movement came through that contact, and that is crucial, because when you are in an absolutely elevated condition, it is I am. That's the only thing it can be, because you have oneness with God. So when you have Sri Krishna talking to Arjuna at that moment, where he and later gave Arjuna this experience, it's and Jesus too. I am the way, the truth, and the life. In that state, you can say that. Out of that state, you can't really. But coming to your point about ascension, it's the ultimate initiation. I think where there is a big change now is that what matters is service. And actually, there's a very simple but wonderful quote. So let me get it right here from the Sixth Freedom. Ascension is that freedom which allows those of merit to perform greater service. How simple does it get? Ascension is that freedom which allows those of merit to perform greater service. It's all about service. If you were in a situation for some reason, and it would probably, I'm sure it would definitely be temporary, where you could actually do more good by not ascending. Now, one would have to sort of stretch one's mind
how that would be possible.
to how that would be possible.
Yeah.
But, for example, there are certain things that if they're touched by ordinary human hands, have a greater karmic power. Ascended masters are under more karmic limitation, because to go beyond it, they would be interfering in our free will. They are, in that way, they're limited by our karma more than a person who is incarnate. And this could be the reason, if I'm right,
I see.
why Count St Germain delayed his ascension.
Yeah, I see.
You can do more. Now, that could apply, and the acid test would be to give greater service. But there would certainly come a time when you would become ascended, not just for yourself, because then you actually could give greater service. Because as I mentioned before, without the ascended masters, nothing would be possible for humanity on earth.
And just one more point here, I think, on ascension, because, in one way we've sort of portrayed it as something extraordinarily exceptional, and perhaps may even feel a little bit out of reach to people in terms of the level of advancement that we're talking about here. But we're also told, I think, in the Nine Freedoms that it's the destiny of us all.
Birthright, yeah.
There's a little bit that you want to say about that in terms of bringing ascension back and this immortality back to ourselves.
What I'd say, and I say that I've got to say this with humility, because I'm in no position to judge, because I haven't done it. So let's start with that. But is that reincarnation as a thing, and this is what you're escaping from when you ascend, or transmuting actually is the correct word when you ascend. reincarnation isn't of itself a good thing. I think we've said this before. It's an important thing to know about, and it's essential to us in order to gain experience. But what should happen on this planet, as it happens on other planets in this solar system, is that we all inhabit ascended bodies and gain experience through a different type of cycle. And so ascension is the natural, what I want to say, is actually a natural form of existence. And this would affect everything. It would affect the other realms of existence. Then they wouldn't be realms, levels of attainment depending on the level you've attained and while you're waiting to reincarnate again.
I see.
They would be high levels of experience which we would be fully aware of in our ascended bodies. An ascended master doesn't need an aura. There's a revelation from the sixth freedom. An ascended master can take the energy they require at any given moment to whatever level they want to take it or need to take it. Mm. And of course, everything they do is in keeping with karmic law. They are guided at that point by their higher selves completely. So this is the way, yes, this is our goal, but in a way you could also say that's where we really get started.
Yeah, that's an
because
inspiration.
we're in an aberration at the moment, having to go through reincarnation, which had to be brought into being on this world, because otherwise we would negatize, I think is the phrase the master theorists used once, our evolution, because there'd be no checks and balances. You know, at the moment we pass on, then we reassess. Our soul addresses our karma. Our next life is determined, and then we come back then to gain the experiences, because left to our own devices, we wouldn't gain the experiences that we need. We'd gain the experiences we want. Everybody would have a long bucket list. Think, I'd like to do this, I'd like to do this, I'd like to do this. But an ascended master or an advanced soul who's approaching ascension doesn't do that. They look at, number one, how can I serve? And number two, what experiences do I need to master? Let's deal with those.
Yeah. No, that's a fascinating way to put it, because, if we ask ourselves the question, what would we do with our immortality at this moment?
Yeah. Serve.
Yeah, we so should. Thank you very much, Richard.
Thank you, Darren.
Hey, Spiritual Freedom Show family. Thanks for tuning into the show. So what I take away from that episode is that here was a man who was way ahead of his time, who, as far as we can tell, delayed his ascension in order to serve amongst mankind and help mankind more, something he would not be able to do otherwise, had he ascended already. But the key is what the story reveals about our own immortality. In other words, the path to ascension. If we dedicate ourselves in selfless service to others, if we resolve to master all of life's experience, and if we detach ourselves from the delusional nonsense of ascension that is discussed in the New Age movement about effortlessly ascending without any effort whatsoever, then we will be soaring towards this immortal spiritual goal. Now, if you enjoyed that episode about Count St Germain and the path to immortality, then don't forget to subscribe or follow the channel for more future episodes in which you can discover spiritual insights and practices that you can use to awaken your chakras, to unlock your psychic powers, and to discover true spirituality for yourself. Now, if you're interested in more right now, I can recommend this video over here, which goes in depth in my conversation with Richard, describing what he learned in raising the mystical power of Kundalini. Thanks for tuning into the show, and see you next time.